Okay, so this is the Bible study for Genesis chapter 31, and it's a pretty long text, but sort of one general focus, I think, and closes up the story that we've been talking about with Jacob and Laban. So let's go ahead and read. The text says, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all his wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've been working for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, The speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, The streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me. In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. I answered, Here I am. And he said, Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flocks are streaked, speckled, or spotted. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. Then Rachel and Leah replied, Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what he paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had, crossed the Euphrates River, and headed for the hill country of Gilead. On the third day, Laban was told Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off and secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's household. But why did you steal my gods? Jacob answered Laban, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the two female servants, but found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched, but could not find the household gods. Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. "What's my crime?" he said to Laban. "How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night. Sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years. For the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks. And you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban answered Jacob, the women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as witness between us. So Jacob took a stone and set up a pillar. He said to his relatives, "Gather some stones." So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha, and Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, "The heap is a witness between you and me today. This is why it's called Galeed." It was also called Mizpah, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me." Laban also said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, and here is this pillar. I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side and harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. So remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study this text. And it's pretty extensive, so we're going to try to move through it swiftly. Number 1 says, what did we learn about in the last Bible study? So the last Bible study was about Jacob standing up and saying, "Okay, I need to leave. I want to go home. I need to build something for my family. I've been building something for your family." And then we learn how he was sort of working with the flocks after Laban agreed to give him a portion of the flocks, um, based on whether they were streaked or spotted or just plain, things like that. He agreed to give them to them, and then Jacob was breeding them in such a way that his um, wages would be larger. while Laban expected his wages to be lower. We'll learn how Laban responded to that. I think we can deduce from some of the things that were said here. Number two, what is happening now according to 31 1 and 2? So now Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all his wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Um, so, in other words, he for 14 years, essentially, he had been keeping track of the flocks, and they had been blessed and multiplied. And what Laban had accumulated was because of the blessing of God on Jacob. And he knew that. He said that in that last text. But now Laban's sons are saying, okay, now Jacob's earning his wages, but he's taking everything from our father. So the blessing is on Jacob, not on Laban. But they didn't see it that way. They kind of felt like Jacob was stealing them, or Jacob was, you know, Jacob's presence was hurting Laban's flocks, or limiting their expansion. I think that's interesting because um, this is silly, but in the history of our church, we've been one church, but we've also been multiple locations. We had, um, Valley and Central, which we called at one time Mountain. We have different campuses. At one time, they were both under the leadership of Pastor Bain, with Steve and I, and then Fred and I as associate pastors, and then they were under Fred and I as co-pastors, and then everything was again under me as the pastor. And so that's been kind of our process, our history that we've gone through. And there have been times when there was dissension between sort of the locations. I think this was particularly true early on, when there was two congregations of essentially the same size. Um, we had well-meaning folks say, I don't want this. I heard a guy say one time, I don't want the church to be run by the other side. They kind of wanted a balanced leadership, which I think we had. There were people that complained if we did the service that was combined in the other location, and they had to go, and they didn't think that was fair, and they were counting the number of times that we had it in each place. All of this, by the way, is selfish and carnal. All of this is maybe our human nature, but not beneficial for the kingdom, not anything that was helpful. So we've really tried to curb that. But of course, then at some point, the Valley congregation was much smaller, and there was a different dynamic. Um, but um, I remember just thinking about sort of income, and this is now all under Mission Albuquerque. One of the reasons we brought it all under Mission Albuquerque is sort of to unify the financial thinking. But it used to be that basically each of the ministries, the daycare, the thrift store, the Valley rental property, at the time, sort of all paid rent to the church. And I was a party to a discussion one time that said, well, the Valley property isn't paying its weight. It's not full, and it's not paying the amount that it should. And so this was the discussion, and I had to stop because I said, okay, stop. Because remember, and I'll just sort of, I don't want to bring up old stuff like this, but I had to stop the discussion because I said, your memory of of the situation is short. So you don't remember that we bought the Valley property outright, and then we mortgaged the Valley property to buy and then remodel the Central property. While they were saying, well, the Valley should pay its way to the mortgage or whatever, and I said, the Valley didn't create the mortgage. The mortgage was largely spent on remodeling the Central property. So what does its weight mean? So you're trying to say, okay, we're going to draw a line, and from here forth it will be equal. Um, and I'm telling you that there was cooperation, there was working together. We operated as one body, as one entity before, and one gave to the other freely. So I guess the point of this, and I hope I don't bring up old memories or negative things or somebody thinking carnally about this again, just by mentioning it. But the point of it is that we were one body, we were one entity, um, and and the and we moved money back and forth freely to as we had need. And so one of the reasons we created Mission Albuquerque, and I think it's actually helped, is that instead of each entity in its place paying rent, instead we think of it more wholly as one entity that works together. But I say all that to say that's kind of the same situation that Laban and Jacob and Laban's sons are in. Is everything was together, and if they're saying, oh, Jacob's taking all of our dad's flocks, that's like a short memory, because remember that your dad had very little flocks until Jacob came. So the fact that Laban became wealthy because Jacob was blessed and caring for the flocks was because of Jacob. So now they're saying Jacob's taking everything, but he's not taking everything. Laban's still better off than he was before. And so the reason I told the story was to illustrate how short our thinking can be, how short our memory can be when we're trying to sort of demand fairness. So many times, for instance, um, it's always funny to me. My grandma was one of these that was really meticulous. If my mom, I remember as a kid, my mom would go pick up groceries. She'd be at the grocery, and my grandma would say, "Hey, while you're there, can you pick up such and such?" Because when my mom went to get groceries, she didn't bring us to tag along. She dropped us off at grandma's house. So grandma was watching us while mom went to get groceries, and grandma said, hey, can you pick up this? So mom picked up that for grandma, and they come back, and she comes back to pick us up, give the thing that she picked up, and my grandma would be like, well, give me the receipt. And she'd be like, oh, she'd be digging in her change purse. I don't have, I'm a penny off. And she was worried about being a penny off. So she wanted it to be dead on fair. But the irony of all that is that what does fairness look like? It depends on what you take into account. So she was narrowing it down to just you bought this for me and I'm going to pay down to the penny of it. But never mind that she didn't pay for gas. Well, should she pay for a portion or a percentage of the gas that it took to get there because mom picked this up? Or is that on my mom because my mom was already going there? So how do we define fairness there with the gas? But okay, if we widen it a little more, let's go the other way. Does grandma get paid for babysitting the kids while you're going to the grocery? So how much is that value? So okay, now we got the cost of the thing that was picked up, and we got okay the gas, but we also got the babysitting. Um, Although I saw a meme one time that says it's not babysitting, they're your kids. If you're the dad, it's not babysitting, they're your kids. And that may be true of grandma too. I don't know. That's your family. Anyway, so we widen it. But if we widen it enough, we get to the amount of money that grandma spent raising my mom. The amount of money. How do you define the rent to keep a roof over a head or mortgage? How do you define the amount of groceries you fed a child? How do you define whatever else you paid for, lessons or sports or whatever? Like we don't keep a ledger of that. Um, So the bottom line is it's never going to be fair. And my mom would have just like, you don't even need to pay me for this. I just picked it up and it was just so funny. When we start working toward fairness and obsessing over fairness, we have to limit our boundaries to be able to find what's fair. We sort of have to narrow the boundaries because, particularly amongst family, the ledger of what goes back and forth in our investment in each other and our care for each other is it becomes quite extensive, and I don't think it's ever going to be fair. And by the way, does it need to be? Should it be? No, because we invest in one another freely. We care for and love one another freely. So anyway, that's why it's so crazy when family fights over this is mine or that's yours, and that's what's going on. Laban's sons are arguing over what's fair or what's going on with Jacob. Jacob is married to their sisters. Jacob maybe is not entitled to an inheritance from their father the way the sons are, because of the way the society was. The daughters wouldn't get an inheritance. Jacob's inheritance should come from the other side. But he worked for him for 20 years, and Laban agreed to wages. So what is fair? Let's just throw fairness out and instead think about care. So if you care for somebody, you make sure that they are physically cared for as well. And honestly, Jacob wanted to leave. It seems 6 years ago. Um, and Laban did not want him to leave because he recognized he was being blessed because of Jacob's presence. And so it was Laban's desire that Jacob stayed when Jacob wanted to leave. And the reason Jacob is now receiving wages from among the flocks is because Laban agreed to that, in order to keep him there, in order to get him to stay. So then the second part said, what did the Lord say? It says, then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob recognizes a change in the dynamic there. And sort of at the same time, I want to be careful because sometimes we think, oh, there's a change in dynamic. Now I need to leave. I feel God saying it. Well, maybe he is, maybe it isn't. He isn't. You better check with God. In this case, he was also at the same time saying it's time for you to go. Um, we don't find 6 years ago that God specifically said to go back to the land of his fathers. We did talk about during that Bible study that this was the sort of thing that God said because he talked about to Abraham about not going back, about being in this land he was going to give him. He talked the importance of Isaac not going, up to the land of Abraham's family was really important. So we know this is important to God, but we don't have record of him saying it before. We now have record of him saying it. Um, specifically to Jacob, as an instruction for right now. We have the general idea that God's desire would be for him to go back, but now it's specifically, it's time to go back and I will be with you. Number three, what happened in 31 4 through 14? A. Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. B. Jacob told him that their father's attitude toward him had changed. C. Jacob told them that he had worked for him with all his strength, but their father had cheated him by changing wages 10 times, changing his wages 10 times. D. Jacob told him, them, it should be them. Jacob told them that God has taken away their father's livestock and has given them to Jacob. So anything that Laban's sons are noticing is because of God's blessing on him, despite Laban continually changing the terms. Jacob told them about his dream and that God has now called them to go back to his native land. So this is key because I don't know if he knew how Rachel and Leah would respond. I don't know if he knew, but he had to persuade them that it's time to go with me, don't stay with your dad. This is what your dad's been doing to me. Now let's go. So number four, how did Rachel and Leah reply? According to 31:14 through 16, their reply was, do we still have a share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Um, does he not regard us as foreigners? So, in other words, they're pointing out that he is treating us like you. We are with you, and so anything he's done to you, he's done to us. So we don't have a share. He spent everything that he received for for us to be married to you. And so we're with you. That's basically their response. Um, so Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. So, in other words, God is working on your behalf, He's working on our behalf. That which God took away from our father, would have been, our inheritance, but our father clearly does not care so much about that. And so God is making sure that we get it through you, which our Father has not cared about caring for you at all. And so apparently they're aware of what's going on, or this story that Jacob has told them has merit, and they can see it. So number five, what happened in 31, 17 through 21? A, Jacob put his children and wives on camels and drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated. B, when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. C, Jacob deceived Laban by not telling him he was running away. So clearly, at the end of this sort of, I don't know, paragraph or this sort of section, as the NIV sort of separates it. Um, we have a list of what could be perceived as Jacob's wrongs in this process. So he didn't go and just tell Laban he was leaving like he did before, but we saw how that worked before. That didn't happen. Um, I don't think we can condone Rachel's actions, but it does give us sort of a window into how Rachel felt about her father and his sort of his cheating of Jacob, and sort of what they deserved versus what their father was holding back from them, for better or worse. So I don't think this is a good thing. In fact, it seems like even in Laban's mind, okay, you have, if you say all of this is yours and you haven't taken anything from me, that's fine. So you want to go back to your father, that's fine. But why did you take my gods? And I'm getting a little ahead of us, but that seems to be the only thing that Laban said that was a reasonable accusation. Was and so yeah. So I think that there's something we can think about or learn from that, because, like, how often are we in the right, but because of our frustration or anger, we overstep and step into the wrong, so that the accusation that before we had no accusation that could be truthfully leveled against us, but um, but we overstepped, and we were willing to step out of what was right, and got to a place where, and this isn't Jacob didn't even know about this, but this is Rachel. But I think about that. There's a lot of times nowadays where there are some definite clear complaints that we could have about some of our political leaders, but when you watch YouTube, you watch Facebook, you listen to people on the news, and you say, okay, here's the deal. That guy is not perfect. That lady is not perfect. They are not even great. When you say this is they're doing this wrong, I agree. When you say they're doing this wrong, I agree. When you say they're doing this wrong, I agree. But when you go here, this is across the line where now your accusation is crazy. So now nobody will follow this other stuff because you stepped over this line and started just making wild accusations. And so I always think, why don't we stay like there are legitimate complaints, there are legitimate accusations. Why would we step over? So in this case, sometimes we have been wrong, but God has taken care of us and everything has been on the up and up, the way it should be. We have legitimate complaints, but once we overstep and we take the household gods, why? What point? I mean, obviously, what like God has been taking care of them. Like not only did they steal something from their father, the thing that she stole were other gods, were these household gods that would be worshipped instead of God. Like God's not in that for sure. So everything else was, we were going so good, and then you had to overstep. So I think we learned a little bit about Rachel here if we hadn't learned it before, and maybe there's some of her dad in there. Um, but anyway, so number six, what did Laban do according to 31, 22, and 23? He pursued them. He took his relatives and he ran after them, which honestly is like raising an army. So when we talked about Abraham and these kings marching out to meet him, you know, um, Laban didn't just take anybody in his family. He took the men of fighting age. He took, it doesn't say that, but he took people that they were going out to pursue Jacob by force. Um, and then what happened in 31:24 is God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." So God cautioned him and gave him direction not to do what he was probably thinking about doing. Number seven, what happened in 31:25 through 30? A. Laban overtook Jacob where he camped in the hill country of Gilead. B. Laban confronted Jacob and asked why he had deceived him and carried off his daughters like captives in the night. Or in war. C. Laban wanted to send them off with joy and singing of music of timbrels and harps. Right. Uh, Laban, Laban, Laban. Either you are just quite the liar, or you really don't know yourself. But we know what happened the last time Laban came and said, or Jacob came and said, "I want to leave." That didn't work out. So Laban is either deceiving himself or he's just really thinking Jacob's a fool that he can deceive him. So D, Laban says he has the power to harm Jacob. This is that war. This is that he came out with the ability and the desire to harm Jacob, to fight. But God spoke to him, so he won't. And then he closed it with, okay, you wanted to go home. That's fine. But why have you stolen my gods? Number eight, how did Jacob respond according to 31, 31, and 32? He told him, I was afraid that you'd take my wives and my children by force. But if anybody took your gods, then they're going to die. So, like he says, this is why, and that's like an easy answer. But what are you talking about stealing your gods? I didn't do that. If anybody's done that, I'll put them to death. They're not understanding my desire. Well, that was quite a commitment there, given that Rachel was the one that he loved, and now all of a sudden there's this sort of deep tension going on because we know that Rachel did this, but Jacob obviously doesn't, and he's made a commitment that's going to kind of hold him to something that he probably wishes he wasn't held to. Um, so yeah. Number nine. what happened in 31, 33 through 35. A, Laban went into Jacob's tent and Leah's tent and into the tent of the two female servants and found nothing. B, he also found nothing in Rachel's tent. C, the gods were hidden in Rachel's camel's saddle and she was sitting on them. D, Rachel told her father she was on her period and she couldn't get up, so he didn't find them. Now, let me just say, I don't know about the spiritual value in this, but this just shows something about. I know that in Israelite law later in the law there was issues of blood were very serious, and things like that. So there was ways of handling this or not handling it. Um, but but this really does show how freaked out dudes get about women's period. I'll just be honest, and particularly maybe fathers are not interested in. Okay, well, far be it from me to make you stand up at this point. And no, I'm not going to look underneath you. And so that was plenty to keep him at bay. So he never found it. He never found the household gods. Um, so I don't think that's a spiritual truth, but it is a seems like a timeless truth about men. Um, Number 10, how did Jacob respond in 31, 36 through 42? A, Jacob was angry and clearly felt justified. So he was angry, and he was probably angry already. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had been accused, but now he seems to have been proven truthful, although we know that he's not really. He's been justified, I guess, but he's not really as justified as he thinks he is because of Rachel. But so he's now emboldened, I guess, to sort of lash back at Laban here. B, Jacob challenges Laban to put anything he found that belongs to Laban in front of them so that the relatives can judge between the two of them. So right now Laban looks foolish in front of both their families, because he has found nothing and he's accused. But where did it go? I mean, he surely knows that he's been tricked here somehow. C, Jacob brings up his work, apparently hard work and suffering and care for Laban's flocks. He says, "Look, I was out there in the cold. I was out there in the heat. I took the hit. If animal came in or a thief came in, you never seen me come in and say, 'Hey, something killed your flock.' I always paid for that. I always took it as a hit against my wages, not against your flocks. Come on now. I deserve better than this." He notes that Laban changed his wages 10 times, so we only know about the once, don't we? Um, and then the wives, he changed that, and then the second time, it wasn't a change, it was an offer. This is what, but we find out in this text that if we read a little deeper, we didn't put all of it here, sort of in the questions here, but it sounds like he'd come and say, you know okay, now it's the street, okay, now it's the spotted, okay, like he was trying to change it up based on whatever was multiplying more. No, I'm not going to give you the thing that's multiplying more. I'm going to give you this thing that's there's less of. And so he keeps changing his wages 10 times. He accuses that God and the fear of his father were the only reasons that Laban didn't cheat him out of everything and send him away empty-handed. So he says, "You knew that I was blessed by God, and perhaps you were afraid of my father and his power. Those are the only reasons you didn't cheat me out of everything and send me away empty handed, all by myself, without my wives, without my children, without any flocks. That would have been what you would have done if it weren't for fear of God and fear of my father." And then it says he calls God's message to Laban in the night a rebuke to stop him from continuing to cheat Jacob and possibly even attack him. He says, so now you've been rebuked by God. That's what that was. You were planning to hurt me. You were planning to attack me as you pursued me, but you've been rebuked. You've been corrected by God because you're doing the wrong thing. You've been doing the wrong thing. You would have continued to do the wrong thing. Um, and so God is correcting you. Number 11, what did they do in 31:43 through 55? So now, Laban suggests they make a covenant, perhaps on account of their shared family, his daughters and grandchildren. So he says, okay, look, we're family. Let's at this point, I'm not sure that he's really happy about all of this, but maybe he's just trying to cut his losses and make sure he doesn't sort of lose his grandchildren too, um, and their love and affection. B, they set up a heap of stones and a pillar and named it in separate languages the witness heap. Essentially, both of those names mean the witness heap. See, it was also called Mizpah because God was involved and was going to be the real witness. So they said it was called Mizpah because God is the witness and he'll be there when nobody else is watching. So that, Laban says, so that don't send my daughters away from you. You take care of them so that you don't take other wives, whatever, so that you're faithful. This is how God is going to be witness between the two of us, not just sort of the monument is a reminder that they will remember, but God is a witness. So let me just put this in context. God has there's the monuments like this are normal in the Old Testament. Some of them between two people, but many of them God says, do this so that you will remember and when your children ask you. So the monument is sort of a ritualistic thing that reminds us. But they called it Mizpah because they recognize that God is a living God and he will also be watching. And so that's the difference sort of between ritual and relationship. That's the difference between religion and serving God, living for God, is that the religion is sort of a reminder for us. But ultimately, God is a living God, and He is a witness to what we're doing. And that's more significant. So the ritual and the little monument is for us to remember and like to point at and say, hey, do you remember? And you say, do you remember? And we see it and we remember. But God watching is a whole different thing. And by the way, more persuasive, more a better more effective in getting us in reminding us to do the right thing when we remember that God is watching. So, what should number 12? What should we take away from all these interactions? Well, I want to go back. Several Bible studies ago, when Laban did what he did with the wives, we said, how do we interpret this? What do we take away from this? And I think I said at that point, God's not finished. This isn't over, and God is just, and God does watch over Jacob. And so ultimately, I think this is sort of the I don't want to say conclusion of the story because the story goes on, but this is sort of the resolution of Laban's unfairness and how God cared for Jacob. We saw it in how he handled the flocks and how he blessed Jacob, and now we see it in God enabling Jacob to get away and Laban calling a truce because God spoke to Laban too. And we do I think the first week I said Laban's a snake. And we talked about how this impacted Leah, and we talked about different things. But Laban, we find out now even more that he has, if we, maybe last week in the flocks we thought, oh, is Jacob being honest here? Is he trying to get more wages than what he deserved? And the commentary I read said no, Jacob is trying to get um, in an honest way what he deserves from a dishonest man who keeps changing his wages. And so, despite Laban keep changing the terms, God continued to bless Jacob to the point where Laban's son said, what's going on here? No matter what, no matter how dad tries to cheat, Jacob still comes out on top. What's that all about? Oh, God's watching over him. Um, and it doesn't feel really finished with Rachel's stealing of those gods, but the rest of everything kind of wraps up here, and there's peace between them. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is God's been watching over Jacob this whole time. God protects Jacob when he cautions Laban, and in the end, Jacob is cared for despite Laban's cheating ways. And I think we need to remember that God cares for us too. A lot of times things are not fair in this world. Um, One of the reasons I'm not worried about fairness, and I always laugh about when people say, well, this isn't fair between this and this. Fairness is. My mom used to tell me life isn't fair. Every time I argued about, well, that's not fair, she said life isn't fair, and I've learned that that's true. It was helpful that she taught me that from an early age. Life isn't fair, and so, but God is faithful, and that's another thing that's important. God is faithful even when life isn't fair, so we can be confident.